Welcome to South2North, coming to you from Johannesburg, South Africa. Most people would agree that donating money to a good cause is a positive thing, but looking deeper into aid and development, a more complex picture emerges. In some cases, foreign aid has been more damaging than helpful, undermining local economies, prolonging wars, and even triggering corruption. On today's show, we explore the different facets of giving and find out why international aid, as we see it today, could become a practice of the past. Africa is more dependent on aid than any other continent, and its citizens have had little choice about whether to accept it or not. Is it possible that we could see Africa taking charge of its own future instead of being the passive recipient of aid? This week, leaders from 5 of the world's leading emerging economies, also known as the BRICS Group, met in South Africa to discuss how South-to-South partnerships can free developing countries from the shackles of aid and Western economic dominance. To help us shed light on this, I've invited Moeletsi Mbeki of the South African Institute of International Affairs, Joanna Kerr, who heads up Action Aid International, and Dr. Oliver Stunkel of the Getulio Vargas Foundation in Brazil. First, we have Dr. Stunkel, who came all the way from Sao Paulo to join us. He has taught global governance at leading research institutions, including Nehru University in India. Welcome, Dr. Stunkel. Welcome to South Africa.
Thank you.
Let's talk about the BRICS. Why was it started?
Well, in 2001, Jim O'Neill, an investment banker at Goldman Sachs, created the grouping of the BRICS. And he argued that the grouping of the 4 countries of Brazil, Russia, India, and China would economically overtake the West over the coming decades. So initially just created as an investment term, it caught the spirit of a decade because the prediction became true in a sense, because over the coming years, in fact, the emerging powers grew much faster than the West. And then in 2006, the BRIC countries decided to take it to another level and actually transform the category into a political consultation group. So since then, there have been yearly summits that take place where presidents and ministers meet. And in 2010, South Africa was invited and participated in the first
Jim
summit.
O'Neill, whom you quoted a second ago, was not very welcoming of South Africa's participation. He felt that South Africa did not belong in the former BRIC group. Why?
Exactly. He said actually South Africa doesn't belong because it was too small and it didn't grow fast enough, as fast as the other countries. So that generated quite a debate, but in a sense, the inclusion of South Africa symbolized that the BRICS took ownership of their own grouping, in a sense, because they said, we don't care what Jim O'Neill says, we are the BRICS. So we feel that South Africa should be included.
Did that also demonstrate that BRICS is not only about economic growth, but also about political influence? Because South Africa has been quite vocal, especially in urging the West to open the door for greater participation of the South on global economics.
Absolutely. So it was initially thought of as an economic category, but the BRICS gave it a political meaning, and South Africa was included because it's an important political actor, also to strengthen the call for reform of global structures, absolutely.
But I don't want us to fall into the temptation of romanticizing this partnership. Amongst the BRICS themselves, is there competition? I know that here in South Africa, China is looked at with suspicion. Is there even a chance of one member dominating the other? Who's to benefit from this partnership?
Well, in a sense, I think there is certainly competition. It would be wrong to say that there will be no competition. The BRICS will work together in harmony. At the same time, I think the example of the BRICS presence in Africa shows that it was because of the rise of other emerging powers that Africa was put back on the map. And that today we see Africa in a very different light than, say, 10 years ago. So, for example, 10 years ago, The Economist had on its cover, it said the hopeless continent, Africa the hopeless continent. And now 10 years later, after the rise of the BRICS, it's called Africa Rising. It just had, The Economist had that on the cover. So I think that shows that through the engagement of emerging powers, Africa did have benefits as well. But at the same time, I think it would be exaggerated to say that there's no competition between the BRICS.
We know that Western economies have been shrinking, but on a per capita basis, they are still bigger than the BRICS, although we are catching up fast. How does the West respond to the BRICS?
Well, at first there was, the strategy, let's say, was neglect. It's quite striking that during the yearly summits, the Western media has been fairly absent. And it's still difficult to find an opinion article in a Western newspaper that says, that's an interesting idea, let's give them a try. And let's see what they can figure out.
Do they have a choice, though, given that the emerging economies are getting a louder voice, the economies in the West are in trouble, so the growth is coming from this region?
Absolutely. Yeah. There's no way around the emerging powers today. In a sense, you could pick any global challenge, be it climate change or failed states or poverty. There's no way to find a solution nowadays without the participation of emerging powers. So in a sense, there is a bit of unease about the possibility of emerging powers teaming up. But in a sense, it's already quite clear that if you look into the future, there will be no solution to any problem without China, India, and the other emerging powers.
One of the key issues that have come out of the summit in South Africa is that of a BRICS developmental bank. Can you tell us what that is and how it will actually work?
The creation of the BRICS Development Bank shows that emerging powers are not satisfied with the status quo and seek to now establish their own institutions, pointing out that there is a lot of need, both in Africa and in India specifically, for large-scale development projects.
In terms of aiding development, is this a viable option, or it's merely a response to the US-dominated IMF and World Bank? So in other words, is this a viable model for development that would aid the region?
Well, yes, I think it is. As I've said, I think the presence of emerging powers in Africa has made it an enormous difference. And in a way, the West has rediscovered Africa in response to China's, India's, Brazil's growing presence in Africa. So in a sense, I think the bank will also allow emerging powers to develop new ideas and practices that are difficult to implement in the existing institutions.
Can countries with so much diversity, ideologically, politically, economically, and I'm talking the BRICS, all of them, can they actually find consensus in changing the world power, world paradigm, and tilting the balance to this region? Is that a positive thing?
Well, yes, they're very different from each other, but in a way they have to work together. I mean, there's no way around that. Again, looking towards 2050, which is not that long in the future, China will be the leading economy. India will be in second or third place. Brazil will be the fourth largest economy. South Africa and Russia will be larger economies. So unless these countries can work together, humanity has a serious problem. So in a sense, the BRICS grouping is a first step towards facilitating cooperation. At the same time, I think it's wrong to point out that these countries, obviously they have bilateral difficulties. There's a border conflict between India and China. But that, to me, is just another reason why the BRICS should meet. Of course, they have problems, and they need the BRICS platform to work it out.
You sound very positive about the BRICS, but let's talk about the relationship between these new partnerships and aid. Will aid be a thing of the past as these partnerships become stronger?
Well, the relationship between the BRICS and Africa is quite a new relationship. It's very difficult to make statements right now, but I'd say that one thing that's interesting is that from the West, there have been temptations or attempts to demonize China's presence in Africa. There has been a lot of reports about malfeasance, about increased focus on natural resources. Of course, China has interest in these aspects. At the same time, China is also in Africa for the long term. So there's a lot of also a cautious approach in Beijing to know that unless China will leave Africa very soon, it has to create long-term partnerships. And that is the same with the other BRICS. At the same time, I would say that the BRICS don't have all the solutions, of course, to Africa's problems. It would be wrong and exaggerated to make that claim. But I think Africa can only benefit from a larger presence of many more countries than just the West as it was.
Well, our next guest has written prolifically about solutions to Africa's developmental problems, and I'm very keen to explore his views about the role of China on the continent. Born to one of South Africa's famous anti-apartheid struggle heroes, Govan Mbeki, it is not surprising that my next guest and his brother took to politics like ducks to water. While big brother, Thabo, took over from Nelson Mandela as president of South Africa, little brother, Moeletsi, chose a less traditional and more rebellious route, I would say. He is a vocal critic of South Africa and other African governments and the author of Advocates for Change, How to Overcome Africa's Challenges. A pleasure to welcome Moeletsi Mbeki.
Hey, how are you? Great to
welcome,
see you.
Moeletsi, welcome. Have a seat, please. So Dr. Stinkel spoke earlier about how the West has tended to demonize China's role on the continent, and many have said, even here in South Africa, that we're being recolonized again by China. What are your views?
I think there is a great deal of exaggeration about China's relations with the African countries. I must say, the regulations of the African countries are really the problem, rather than China.
Can you elaborate on that? What is the problem?
You see, one of the problems, if you look at South Africa's regulations, according to South Africa's regulations, there are certain levels of skills that you don't need to import from outside South Africa. So the government would never allow the Chinese to bring people from China where South Africans have the skills. But the Chinese themselves are quite happy with the arrangement. It gives them access to high-level South African skills in the mining sector. As a result, their joint venture is very profitable. So that is one side of it. There are, however, African countries which don't regulate.
What about the rest of the BRICS partnerships? What does our involvement there mean? And also in terms of the South's position in the world?
Well, South Africa, of course, being our large, diversified economy in Africa, has a lot of relations with other BRICS member countries. For example, India. We have Indian companies here like the Tata Group, like Mahindra and Mahindra, who are major investors in South Africa. Oliver's own country, Brazil, Brazil owns mines, coal mines in Mozambique, which is a neighbor of South Africa. So they have to cooperate with South Africa to develop their own mines, to source supplies from those countries. Russia, the Renaissance Bank, for example, from Russia, is very active in South Africa.
Does the BRICS, though, offer a new paradigm in terms of the overall development of the continent?
It's very difficult to say. The key issues about Africa is where we, the Africans, are going, not how we relate to outside players. So if you look at the African economies, we have allowed the African economies to deindustrialize. And many people blame the Chinese for the deindustrialization of African economies. Actually, it's not the Chinese who caused the deindustrialization. We allowed our own industries to rot.
Where do we place aid in terms of our development? Should we just jettison all requirements for aid and focus on our own economies, or there's still a role and even a moral obligation from the West to provide aid?
We have countries that are doing reasonably well. We have countries that are in the middle of conflicts. We've just lost 13 soldiers in the Central African Republic, which is in the middle of a civil war of sorts. So they are huge. And then you are having countries that are emerging from mega domestic conflicts like Rwanda, which had a genocide 20 years ago. So African countries are at very different level, not just of development, but of stress.
Are you saying there are those that do need aid?
Absolutely. If you are having a country like Rwanda that is emerging from a genocide, then you do need aid to rebuild the country and the society.
Dr. Stinkel, I want you to come in here. I mean, we focused on aid and Africa, but are there any parallels to be drawn when it comes to aid between Latin America, for example, India, Brazil, Africa?
Well, the BRICS have actually turned out to be emerging donors, so-called emerging donors, and they've attempted to avoid many of the mistakes that have been made by Western donors. But I think they're at the beginning of a long journey, except for China, which has been giving aid for decades. I mean, China, even under Mao, was quite an engaged actor in Africa. I mean, Brazil has been in Africa for not that long, and it's experimenting with new attempts. But I think one of the new approaches would be to not engage in a donor-recipient hierarchy, but to see these countries as partner countries. So I think there's a lot of attempts from the BRICS countries to provide help, but also organize this as a mutually beneficial relationship and not, as I said, commit those mistakes.
But not make people passive or make one region beholden on
Exactly.
another. Our next guest will speak more about that, and she is a tireless human rights activist and anti-poverty campaigner. Joanna Kerr heads up Action Aid International, one of the world's most influential NGOs. Now, the organization is present in over 45 countries and employs thousands of people worldwide. Welcome, Ms. Kerr.
Well,
Hi, John.
Thank you very much, Joanna. Have a seat, please. So let's talk about this. Is aid addictive?
Aid is going to exist for the current moment. But one thing that I think we need to be clear about is that not all aid is the same. And there are very, very different forms of aid, and there's high quality aid. We actually refer to real aid, that actually tackles poverty, that which promotes human rights.
But hasn't there been too much of the other kind, especially on the African continent, where even the West is involved, there are conditions, they're involved in the domestic politics of the country, feeding corruption?
Absolutely. You know, as an organization, we would be campaigning against forms of aid that are serving very, very narrow interests, often investment, corporate interests, military expansion, and that aren't truly trying to tackle poverty eradication, sustainability, tackling inequality. But what we're seeing now is a real shift, particularly by citizens in this continent, who are saying they want capable democratic governments who are going to be accountable to their citizens, not to either a foreign donor or a foreign investor, whether they come from the West or from BRICS countries.
How do you feel then about partnerships like BRICS? Weleti has given us examples of successful partnerships between China and its partners on the African continent. Surely it is in the interest of our economies to grow, then we won't need aid, and therefore we won't need organizations like yourself, Action Aid.
We're very committed to any type of South-South partnership that is actually going to try to redefine development and redefine what are alternative models of economic development. We've heard from Weleti about industrialization. Very clearly, there hasn't been industrial policies that need to actually focus on creating employment for young people. We need models that are going to bring together the issues of inequality, sustainability, human rights, and are going to actually achieve better lives for everyone. But right now, what we're hearing from some of the BRICS leaders is more of the same. We're not necessarily getting this new paradigm that is going to ultimately lead to sustainable development and human rights for all.
You've told us about instances where aid is working, and I've just mentioned that you've got a presence in about 45 countries, but there's been a lot of criticism as well. For example, that the donor agencies themselves are using the money that they have to employ their own friends, their own family, and the actual aid is not going to the people. How do you respond to that?
Remember, organizations like ours have more than 500,000 individual donors from Brazil, from India, from Sweden, from all parts of the world who are part of a global solidarity movement. They want to see people rise up from situations of human rights violations and poverty. So we hold ourselves to account. We therefore give space for citizens to hold governments to account. And without citizens, space for citizens and for the media to be holding both governments and corporations to account, we'll never get out of this mess.
You're almost painting a very idealistic picture, and I wish the world were that perfect. But the concern that aid in some instances has been used as a gateway to Africa's natural resources. Do you have examples of that? Has that happened?
I think you could paint that picture of just about any investor or donor that wants to work on this continent, really. But I think there's something that we haven't said on this panel. More revenue is created through taxation on this continent than through aid. And there's a huge opportunity right now where we can stop tax avoidance, particularly by corporations. There is so much money that can be domestically mobilized on this continent to, as in your words, to remove the shackles of aid.
Well, Leslie, you've been nodding there, and I know that you feel very, very strongly about leadership. And in fact, I read somewhere that you actually said that this continent was better under colonial rule. Did you mean that, or was that just sibling rivalry? Because your brother, Thabo Mbeki, our former president, has tried to put Africa on the global map with the launch of NAPAD and calling for more equal relationships.
No, I never said that Africa was better off under colonialism. This was one of the journalists who got carried away looking for a headline.
You were quoted out of context, as politicians here like to say when they're caught out.
So, no, the question of accountability really of African governments to the citizens is at the heart of the development project. If you don't have accountability, if the elites and the governments and the corporations are not accountable to the people, then you will never have development because they benefit small elites. The issue that Joanna raises about taxation. Yes, African governments have to run efficient tax regimes, tax collection, but as the Americans said many, many years ago, you can't have taxation when you don't have representation.
Well, Leslie, I do want to ask you this. Again, China's human rights record continues to be spoken about when we talk about economic development. Is that another attempt to demonize China? Should we even care about democracy and human rights as partners in BRICS?
The question of human rights in China, human rights in South Africa, is a question of huge concern to South African citizens and to other African citizens. I think it's very important that we have to support the question of human rights for people in other countries. We in South Africa got huge amount of support from the world's citizens during our crisis with the apartheid regime that we were faced with.
Dr. Steenkel, before we even wrap up the show, I want to ask then, the answer to our development, does it then lie in these South-to-South partnerships?
Well, I think they are part of the solution. Certainly, they're not the only. They're not all of the solution. South-South trade and ties cannot solve all the problems. But I think, as I've said in the beginning, I think South Africa has benefited so much and has put it back on the map, has created more attention, has changed the way we think about Africa. If somebody would have said 10 years ago that an African country is part of a very exclusive emerging powers club that many other countries want to be part of. I mean, you know, of Mexico, Indonesia, Turkey, all of them have expressed their interest in joining, but an African country has actually joined. I think nobody would have believed that. So in a sense, I think it's also an inspiring moment that emerging powers can together make a difference in Africa.
So, Mweleza, are we likely to see more projects like the ones that you highlighted when we started this program? I mean, it's not just about the partnerships, but you want the partnership to translate into projects that create jobs.
The example of Brazil, this huge Brazilian company called Vale, which is a massive mining company, it's developing metallurgical coal mines in Mozambique, which will benefit the whole region of Southern Africa. So it's developing railways, which link Mozambique with, for example, Malawi, in transporting these resources that are there. So I'm also quite optimistic about South-South cooperation. I think it's a good thing. However, as I said before, the world really is coming together. Mm-hmm. It's just that the colonial era, when we were dominated as the South, we were not allowed to link with each other. But the North linked with each other all the time. So we are now having this paradigm of everybody linking with everybody else.
So from those linkages then, Joanne, when donors say they're suffering from fatigue, as we've heard before, and they've got their own domestic issues, we don't need to get depressed because the partnerships will yield much needed development. It's in our interest.
It's absolutely in our interest, and also it's not just governments that are caring about it. It's citizens, it's individuals who are donating to these causes to end environmental crisis, to end inequality, to all of these things. So I think that it's not just for us to look to the traditional donors for any solution, and that Africans are shackled by this. Africans themselves are very much part of driving the solution.
Okay, your optimism has fed off, and I'm also starting to feel it. Thank you very much, Joanne Kerr, for coming to South2North, Moeletsi Mbeki, and of course, Dr. Oliver Steenkamp. Thanks for joining us. Well, thank you for joining me on South2North tonight. You can tweet your questions, comments, and opinions to @AJ South2North or find us on Facebook. See you next week. Bye-bye.